So this question about then, what's the difference between autistic people and non-autistic people, or autistic people and neurotypical people, if such a thing exists?
Obviously, everyone who isn't autistic isn't neurotypical because they might be ADHD or dyslexic or whatever. So some people use that term allistic to mean not autistic. I find the term neuronormative culture or neuronormative society a bit more useful these days. So in other words, how does autistic culture operate? How does neuronormative culture operate? And I think the reason that I think it's a useful thing to talk about is because I actually find it useful in the therapy setting in two ways. If you're trying to figure out what autistic is and whether you're autistic and which bits are autistic, then a comparison helps. Autistic in comparison to what? In comparison to the neurotypical ways of being or expectations are the most common ways of describing human psychology. What's the comparison between the two? The autistic way of being, of thinking, of feeling, of doing, of sensing, and the neurotypical or whatever you call it way of the most common mainstream ways of thinking and doing and feeling.
Yeah. So this question about then, what's the difference between autistic people and non-autistic people, or autistic people and neurotypical people, if such a thing exists? So is that a whole thing in itself?
Yeah, well, that is probably a good starting point. I mean, for a start, some people also use the word allistic or allistic to distinguish from autistic. I don't tend to use it myself, but because obviously everyone who isn't autistic isn't neurotypical because they might be ADHD or dyslexic or whatever. So some people use that term allistic to mean not autistic. I mean, I suppose what I'm thinking of for today is the more broad term of neurotypical, but that is a strange term in itself because are we talking about neurotypical people or neurotypical culture? I mean, for a start, there isn't some specific thing that person is 100% neurotypical. It's like, it's not a diagnosis. It's not like, well, you're definitely autistic, you're definitely neurotypical. How many types of difference do you have to not have before you're neurotypical? Like does introversion count? But like also a lot of neurodivergent people, obviously a lot of autistic people could be just extremely masked and be behaving for all intents and purposes like a neurotypical person, in which case the outcome on the outside is much the same for people's experience. I find the term neuronormative culture or neuronormative society a bit more useful these days. So in other words, how does autistic culture operate? How does neuronormative culture operate? And I think the reason that I think it's a useful thing to talk about is because I actually find it useful in the therapy setting in two ways. If you're trying to figure out what autistic is and whether you're autistic and which bits are autistic, then a comparison helps. Autistic in comparison to what? In comparison to the neurotypical ways of being or expectations are the most common ways of describing human psychology. And the other value, so I found that quite productive as a discussion with various clients, which means that I end up needing to tell them a bit about how neurotypicals think, because people don't know how other people think or how their ways of thinking differ until somebody tidies it up a bit for them. And the other value I find is simply helping to, sort of bridge the divide of the double empathy problem. So the more an autistic person understands how the neurotypical world operates, the better they'll be able to deal with it, like being in a foreign country, So I find it a fascinating question. What's the comparison between the two? The autistic way of being, of thinking, of feeling, of doing, of sensing, and the neurotypical or whatever you call it way of the most common mainstream ways of thinking and doing and feeling.
Yeah, I know, because it's, in fact, actually, I'm just going to refer to my notes down here because I found a lovely article by Daniel Crawshaw, and it's called "Should We Continue to Tell Autistic People That Their Brains Are Different?" I know, and I thought, oh, that sounds like an interesting article. And basically what he was saying, his argument is that cautiously maintaining that notion of categorical neurological difference for lay people, not for neuroscientists or anything like that, because he's basing his argument on the fact that the social and psychological functions of the label serve a need, serve a lot of good actually for autistic people. So while there might not be genetically, there are not certain markers, lack of clear genetic, neurobiological or cognitive markers, and that there's a lot of overlap, of course, between, things that you might recognize as common to autistic people that exist in people who might be described in other ways, such as ADHDers or, different things.
Other neurodivergences, yeah.
Well, yeah. But in fact, that the positive identification with being autistic is associated with better self-esteem and mental health, and is likely to introduce a person to the access to other people, to want to exchange ideas and experiences, and that can bring a sense of belonging and self-acceptance. And as well, that autistic people do tend to like to talk about that. That's a big part, isn't it, of our way of collectively saying that in some ways this is who we are, our brains are different, and it's been a common thing that people have said, and that is seen in a very positive way, in a very bonding kind of statement.
Yeah, and I think it's just has its place in the mix, to my mind, because our brains are different, and neurology tends to be the official focus because it's neurodiversity and neurodivergence we're talking about. But in practice, I don't talk about brains. I don't tell people how the brains of neurotypical people are different from the brains of autistic people, and I know nothing about my brain. And to be honest, neurologists don't know a lot about the autistic brain yet, and they, can't identify a lot of differences. Right? And so, it's not that we have lots of neurological information or detailed genetic information. It's just that we assume that all psychology has to be based in the brain, even if a lot of it has to emerge during the developmental period. I mean, the actual differences that we talk about all the time are psychological, social, sensory, information processing, emotional, but then we are assuming they are functions of the brain. The other criticism that has been made of the purely neurological way of seeing it is the more embodied approach, saying, well, actually, we have different brains, nervous systems, bodies, a whole lot. You know what I mean? It's like, okay, the brain is a fairly central part of that, but it'd be a bit like saying the Irish, political system is different from the Japanese political system. Let me show you the difference, and then only show the government, only show the parliament. You'd have to show everything else, the civil service and the local politics and everything. That's the difference. So in a sense, there's some very interesting stuff being written and talked about recently about any differences have to be in the brain, yes, but they have to be in the body in various ways. And so embodied is another interesting way of looking at it. But yeah, it boils down to the practical differences that most ordinary people can see are, psychological, social, communicative, emotional ways of living, sets of preferences, all the stuff that we usually list out, I mean, after all, even the DSM doesn't say anything about neurology in the end, really,
Oh, yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah. And I suppose if you're thinking about I like your thing about the Japanese and the Irish governments as a way to distinguish between the two, because if you're thinking also about how those policies and get enacted, and how they affect the lived experience of the people that are living within those broader living conditions and those institutions and structures and policies and permissions and all the rest of it. And like with autistic people, one of the big differences, of course, between autistic people and non-autistic is the life experience, the way that the experiences that you've encountered in your life. There's a lot of overlap, a lot of commonality between autistic people with that. Whereas with traits, if you like, of personality or other types of things, there's a lot of wide variety within autistic people.
And it brings us back to that question of, what will it be like? What would it like to be not dealing with traumatized autistic people? In other words, most autistic people grow up feeling stigmatized, strange, excluded. But what if they didn't? How would that look? We've only a small sample of that, really. You know, the reality of most people do feel those things, so they have to be part of the picture. But then, you know, this is a point in history. You know, we were talking about autism and autistic people very differently 20 years ago, and we may well be talking differently again in 20 years. So anything we say now it's about this point in history, really, and experience of the current sense of differences between being autistic as an individual and the autistic community or population, and the whatever that mainstream neurotypical assumed, you know, assumed kind of way of being is, because in some ways it is more of a it's you know, I won't say better understood, but equally well understood as a social phenomenon. In other words, it's about assumptions. It's about what's just seen as typical and normal, and everyone assumes it. But autistic people don't match that, so we end up struggling not because we're just seen as different, but because we're seen as, but this is all obvious, and isn't this just the way to be? Isn't this how humans are, you know? So, you know, that could be, not that everybody who lives that way has the same brain. It could just be neuronormative society and we fall out of it, you know? So I think that's that, in the end of it all, that's the comparison that kind of matters at the moment. Who knows where we'll be with that in 20 years' time.
Yeah, because the more, obviously, let's hope, hey, the more that it gets recognized that there are a variety of people that you know, and that society is understanding that more, and you know, doing things differently and making spaces be different and expectations to be different, then first of all, the pressures to conform or to bend to that, or to deny one's real self and preferences and needs will be getting less and less, and therefore the trauma will get less and less, and so on. Yeah,
so more recognition of variety and validity of that variety, you know. But like, you know, for me, the therapy room is a very pragmatic place, you know. I don't have to have the kind of knowledge I would put into an article or even a webinar. I just need to have enough rough knowledge, you know, description, psychoeducation around differences between, you know, autistic people in general and mainstream humans in general, to help the client in front of me. And I think, you know, my first kind of, or, you know, my first way into that, the first, you know, thing I often talk about is politics with a small p. In other words, the big difference between what seems to be happening all the time between, you know, an autistic person's more mainstream colleagues, that the autistic person gets lost in or confused by or caught out by or is bored by or whatever. I think a lot of it can be put under that heading of politics with a small p, not politics like national politics, but politics like, you know, all sorts of communications around status and hierarchy and alliances and shifting alliances and loyalties and you know, exchanges of information and assumptions that are passed from one to the other, and rules that are unwritten rules, or that seem to have exceptions that nobody actually names, and all that kind of stuff. I think that's an initial stab at describing that difference. And that's interesting for autistic clients, because until somebody says that to them clearly, I find they haven't really thought of it. So actually, that is actually what's going on in all their minds. And yeah, no, that doesn't go on in my mind, but I didn't really know whether it went on in other people's minds or not. So that's an autistic difference, is it? You know, it's like just clarifying that can be really useful. Yes, it is. We left to ourselves on our own, but also left to ourselves with other autistic people. We just don't do much of that. We don't really care. You know, and anyway, whatever we care about, we're more direct about. So if we're concerned about our connection with somebody and lessening our connection with someone else, we'll just be much more straight about it. You know, sorry, I'm more working with this person this week. Do you know what I mean? We won't play games around it. Games, which is an interesting transactional analysis term, is another way of looking at the whole thing, of again explaining that different world, the mysterious neurotypical world, to an autistic person, and the comparison with how they think, straight, blunt, open, take things at face value. No, that's not how the world in general works, So I think that's a real eye opener and quite a kind of it's like a map of the territory a bit, or the beginning of one for a lot of my autistic clients, particularly, newly discovered ones.
That's a really interesting thing, about a segue maybe into the thing about games, because if we're using that in a technical term, in using the transactional analysis definition of games, in other words, that's a psychological and social exchange between two people that is a sequenced set of transactions that starts with a con and a gimmick and ends up with a switch in the middle and then a payoff. But what's really going on there, that gets seen and laughed about or denied, or all those things, but actually underneath, people are trying to get their needs met. And that's a really interesting thing that you say about game playing, because the reason that game playing isn't great is because the psychological message, which is not the same as the social is the overt and the psychological is the covert. And obviously, if things are conveyed covertly, or there's a covert agenda that one person knows about but the other one doesn't, that's pushing the communication or the drive forward, then there's going to be a switch, because, I didn't think it was leading to that. Oh, dear me, now here's the switch, and now we're both ending up in a bad payoff, potentially. That's the problem with games when they're negative. But of course, with autistic people, generally speaking, I would say, have a tendency for more, a preference for giving and receiving more communication and intention more overtly. So then that reduces the amount of game playing by default. And actually, when we're in session with clients, often when processing things together, and when clients are processing and when I'm processing what's happening in the session or what we're dealing with, what we're talking about here, I'm wanting to make things more overt so that I can think it through. And I'm going like that because it's in a logical detail building upon detail to make sense kind of way.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I always noticed that about myself as a therapist even before I knew I was autistic. It's just but I was autistic always, obviously, but I love explicit, I really like, just putting it out there and wondering aloud, for instance, or explaining why I'm going a particular direction, or why I would think we would talk about something, but I do think that, that's very autistic friendly, is that kind of overtness. Now, overtness is not going to be much good to you if you're a diplomat, you know what I mean? And I always, when I talk about this stuff with clients, I generally joke a little bit and say, technically, the difference that we're talking about here between the neurotypical world and the autistic world is neutral. It's neither is good or bad. They're just different. Neither should discriminate against the other. Both have their values in different contexts. And I might give the example of the diplomat versus the health and safety officer, and not only that, despite the fact that some people say, wouldn't it be great if we were all autistic? I'm not sure that it would be. Who knows? Maybe the world just needs about the proportion of autistics that it has to operate well, or maybe it would operate better, whatever we mean by better, So I say, technically, this is a neutral difference we're talking about, but I also say, but I'm autistic. So I'm not going to come across quite neutral. Do you know what I mean? In other words, I'm talking about these, but like yourself as a client, I prefer a lot of this stuff. I prefer overtness, and I'm not interested in some of that politics with a small p, and feel it's just a waste of time. And so I have my own stance on it, and I'm clear about that, and then we get on with it. But technically, it's just games exist for a reason,
And that overtness as well can be useful. I'm just thinking about in client sessions, or in client work, let's say, because I will often ask myself what my covert agenda might be, interestingly.
True. Yes.
So I'll say, Borna, why did you just do that?
Yeah.
And that's been really useful.
I do that a lot. That's interesting. Yeah. I watch myself and I think, why did I do that? That's interesting. Yeah.
I wonder if that's what masked autistic people are doing, because obviously you and I have grown up with certain elements of ourselves being camouflaged for various reasons that we've talked about before. And it's a lifetime of undoing that. And we've done a lot of it, but there's still stuff to do. So I wonder if that is part of unmasking it, because it's about asking ourselves what our true self is, what our true state is, or what our true, true is a difficult word there, but natural, let's say, you know, or even, embodied, would you say? Or like signals from the body can tell you things that are really useful about what you like and what you are drawn to, and what you prefer, what you need, in fact, or what you don't need. And we've often been trained, if you like, by society to close those things down, such as, oh, stop going over and over the details. You know, it just is like that, you know, but we wanted to go over the details for these kinds of reasons.
No, definitely. And, you know, I think that sort of self-monitoring is something you learn to do a lot more of through masking. And then even when you don't need to mask so much, you have the self-monitoring habit, which of course has good purposes as well as negative purposes. And so I definitely have that self-monitoring habit. And in a way, it helps me, you know, keep an eye on whatever work I'm doing and kind of self-supervise a bit and internal supervisor stuff, but also it is. But it also helps me keep watching my own autistic processes, because in the end of it all, the only autistic person I know from the inside is me, you know. So in trying to have familiarity with how autistic minds work, well, then I've only got one direct sample, you know. So I do find that ongoingly interesting, you know. But you know, the other thing that I would say then, you know, as well, is that in talking about, you know, kind of mainstream ways of thinking and so on, I would say that, you know, we're talking about mainstream psychology here. In other words, the things, particularly when I go into a couple of the details, like, you know, status and hierarchy and alliances and things like that. I say to a client, look, if you read a psychology book, it'll be psychology of neurotypical people, of the mainstream, of the average, you know, and it'll say things like I'm about to say, but it'll just say them as facts, you know. Human beings are very status and hierarchically conscious. And, you know, any group that gets together, like at the start of, you know, first year in secondary school, you know, people start to form groups. Those groups immediately start to become hierarchical, you know. There's nothing even controversial about that. That's just mainstream psychology, mainstream sociology, you know. But for autistic people, it's like they're saying, really, is that real? Because you're right, I don't relate to that. That explains a whole lot of the mysteries of my adolescence. I mean, that's what everybody was at, you know. So unless they have studied psychology, they usually just don't know that. And it's a real revealer, because it makes them understanding what's going on around them a bit better, but it also makes them think, yes, that is how I'm different. Okay, great. That's another tick in the ways in which I'm clearly different, because no, I don't have any interest in hierarchy or where I come in the pecking order or any of that, you know. And I think the kind of shifting alliances formation pieces are two of the very revealing pieces for autistic people, because number one, they realize, oh, that's what's been happening around me. And number two, they realize, no, I'm not interested. I don't follow it. There's no need. I can do all of that overtly. I don't need to do it covertly. If I want to be friends with someone, I just ask them to be friends. If it's done, I just move on, and, you know, it's done, you know. And so it is. I find those things really kind of very much open up a kind of a level of awareness for people. Then, I mean, I had to go through this process myself. Like I didn't have that clarity initially, you know. For me, that was a very drawing those lines a bit more clearly was very, very revealing a number of years ago, you know, just realizing just where those big differences lie, you know, that have huge implications, you know. And that's saying nothing about sensory differences or passionate interests or any of those other pieces. These are just the social bits, the politics with the small p, you know.
I mean, Nick Chown in his book does say that the only difference between autistic people and non-autistic, say if there were only two groups of people, I think that's what he was drawing it down to, is perception and attention. In other words, the things that we perceive are done differently, and then we attend to different things or in different ways differently. Like the monotropic theory. Of the Murray, isn't it?
Murray and Lawson.
About the channels of attention and things like that, the focus of attention, which can be very useful and pleasurable for autistic people to get into, like a flow state in a way, which can lead into support passionate interests, can't it?
Yeah, but I think that is a very interesting addition, and it might be a kind of another strand we might come back to. Is that I think that does directly link with the differences that we're talking about here, because another thing that I would say about autistic people and say to autistic clients is that what we're not saying here is that we're completely incapable of these things. The deficit model says we can't do small talk. We can't do taking a position in a hierarchy like being a manager, but that's not true. It's that we're not interested. And our attention has been focused elsewhere, or isn't just focused elsewhere now in our adulthood, but all through our development. Our attention was focused elsewhere, while neurotypical people's attention was focused on learning how to be in hierarchies and find their position in it and find a good position in it and follow all these shifting alliances between neighbors or whoever the group is, all the time through things like gossip. After all, we can mask. So autistic people can learn to do it.
And take up those values, potentially.
Consciously, we can learn to, what does it mean to be a manager in this point in the hierarchy, and what's my job and how do I do it, how do I keep track of, because sometimes I have to keep track of the alliances, even though I wish I didn't have to care about them. I suppose I need to know about them, in my work or whatever, okay, and so is visiting, I better do at least a few minutes of small talk. We can do it. It's not like it's rocket science, it's just that, no, our perception and attention have never been focused there because we're too busy focusing it elsewhere. I think that's a really interesting kind of linking thing to bring in. Yeah.
But of course, being immersed in culture, say in a corporate culture, if that's gone on from a young age, or one's parents have been in those circles and have been amongst those kinds of discussions and belief systems about this is how you do life, this is how you do work, not just this is how you get ahead. Here's my master plan, but
that's
potentially this is how you do it. Actually, and really believing that and not recognizing that there might be a different way, or there might be, because of course autistic people can be managers and might enjoy doing so, but in a different, because they can't not be, can they, in the world?
No, if you want promotion, and there'll be aspects they won't enjoy, and they usually become a particular kind of manager who's very straight about things and very practical rather than all diplomatic and kind of managing everybody in a personal kind of way, but still, they can still. It's not like after all, if we couldn't understand this stuff, we couldn't become psychologists and psychotherapists and even be, half decent parents. Do you know what I mean? So as I said, it's not like literally this stuff is a utter mystery by its very nature and we can never understand it. That isn't the difference. A little bit like what the double empathy problem theory says. It's like cultures can understand each other. In the end of it all, any person from any culture can understand any other person from any other culture if they just put the work in. But you got to put a lot of work in. And that's not the area that autistic people put the work in without even knowing that they're not putting the work into it. They just don't. When they're growing up, they're far too interested in a whole lot of other things, not what is this shifting tapestry of alliances and small talk around me. Do you know what I mean? Which is exactly where the attention and perception of the neurotypical person is going. So that's a very interesting point and maybe worth coming back to. Fascinating stuff, I think, personally as well, because I live it, and we said we might talk a bit more about some of that as well in podcasts maybe later in the year a bit, just some of our own experiences. But this to me, all the stuff is, this is me. I'm one of the autistic people, so everything I've said there is part of my experience as well. For all my life and on a daily basis still.
This is not going to be a pleasant thing to say, but I won't say more. But I want help because I just keep referring to things that the clients can't do, such as feelings, etc. I just thought, oh no, please don't say that, because that's dehumanizing autistic people. Of course we have feelings, of course we experience things in we have a whole emotional world, and we express and share those feelings and feel them.
Well, yeah, I mean, I suppose they mostly need training.
Our past podcasts, which are free to view, and which
there you go, they are indeed. Yeah.
People can learn an absolute enormous amount actually by what we're talking about, because of us being autistic people ourselves, so talking from the inside, but also about being psychotherapists and talking about it from the practitioner's point of view as well.
Yes, that's not great to hear, but we know it's out there. Yeah, it's not great to hear it.
So you and I are having this conversation about what are the differences between autistic people and non-autistic people, and what's out there in the world in some places and some pockets of people is that they already think that they know what those things are, don't they? And that they have these preconceived ideas, and that they're putting values to them as well.
And certainly, again, I emphasize that point, even that, we're not even talking about incapabilities, we're talking about different values and different motivations and different attention and different, just different ways of living, different trajectory of life, yeah. So, yeah, there's obviously loads of work still to be done on the awareness raising and training side. Yep.
Yeah. Which will reduce the stigma. And, if you can get to know autistic people, or get to know us by watching even, that's something, isn't it? Because getting to understand the real stuff does actually reduce the stigmatization, the alienation of it, because it's not alien then, is it? It's familiar. It's something that's known and that you can relate to, because we are human beings, of course, and we are different, but still humans. The same. Different but the same.
Different but the same. Well, yeah, I was using the metaphor of plants when I was giving my conference talk for Awesome there recently, and I used a made up plant label, like one you stick plastic one you stick in a pot of where there's a plant, and it had at the top it said human, and then in brackets it says autistic variety.
Yes. A different strand or a different.
So it isn't a plant called autistic person, it's a plant called human, and then the variety of this plant in this case is the autistic variety, and there are lots of other varieties, so it's again, different way of seeing things, but ways of seeing things are very important, paradigms. It's great to always have a good discussion. It's great food for thought.
Good talking to you. I love our chats.
And I forgot, I hadn't read Nick Chown in a while. I don't know, does he have anything recent? I wonder. He's a good author.
That book I was speaking to, I'll put it in a link in the thing. I can't remember the title of it, of course. But he's done a lot. Obviously he's a professional academic now, isn't he?
He's a philosopher, I think, or along those lines. All right. Brand, well, look, take care of yourself in the meantime, and sure.
Yes, thank you.
Keep in touch.
Yeah, you too. Thanks.
See you soon. Bye now.
Bye.